good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are. And thank you for joining us. This series is called Conversations with ARI, so Afghanistan Research Initiative. This is a initiative based in University of Central Asia, and we discuss everything Afghanistan, mostly on development, education, economics, sustainability, and more. So, and thank you, Dr. Harun Rahimi, for taking the time and talking to us. Really appreciate it. I should maybe also point out that our surnames are Rahimi by accident. We are not related to each other. And yeah, so thank you for joining us. And I thought, let me just say a couple of things to set the scene before I hand over to you. So, education is a central story in the case of Afghanistan and its development. Since the return of the de facto authorities in Afghanistan in 2021, a lot of international attention has understandably focused on the closure of girls' schools and restrictions on women's access to higher education and so on. Yet, at the same time, another part of Afghanistan's education system, that is the religious education through madrasas, has continued to operate and in many respects has expanded. And I think this raises important questions that may be overlooked or often overlooked. So what we will do is we will discuss these and a broader context to give this discussion a broader historical perspective to it as well. So these days, when you hear the word madrasa in many media, you immediately associate this exclusively with religious education. Historically, that is not the case. So if the picture is much more complex. So for centuries, this wider region of Central Asia and Southeast Asia, so the so-called Indo-Persian Empire, this region, this geographical region. Madrasa has much broader meaning, and most of the people that we know of today probably studied in a place like madrasa. I was reviewing the book by Frederick Starr, The Lost Enlightenment. It's amazing to see most of these big names, come from a background that contributed to medicine, to algebra, and etc. And they've all studied in some place that you may call madrasa. So what I propose is that we do this in two parts, the discussion, and then we just take it wherever it goes from there. The first is to take a step back, explore a little bit the longer history of education in Afghanistan and the wider region, and understand these institutions that we are discussing, the modern school in the traditional school that we know of, and madrasa, and where they come from, to help us better understand this. And then secondly, we can turn into the findings of the paper, the recent research that you've done, examining madrasa sector, essentially, the future of education, governance, and also maybe to state building if we have time. So that's the kind of thing I have in mind. And with that, I'm going to hand over to you. So could you tell us about this historical context of the region that includes Afghanistan and shed light on this dichotomy, if you like?
Of course, thanks first of all for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I've listened to some of the conversations we had before with the other colleagues, and it's been a real pleasure. I appreciate that. You were absolutely right. So when often people hear the word madrasa, they in their mind they distinguish that they kind of cross-distinct that with contradistinct that with secular education, or what is in Afghanistan known as general education. So just even the way we think about this right now, it's in opposition to secular education, which means it is a product of modernity because secularity is a product of modernity. It did not exist in pre-modern period. As you rightly pointed out, education in pre-modern period was not. It was much more holistic and comprehensive because this idea of religious education and non-religious education did not exist. Knowledge was seen as much more interconnected. Major figures in Islamic thought and in religious sciences were also major figures in what later came to be known as natural sciences or secular sciences or general sciences. People like Avicenna, people like Biruni, others wrote on a range of topics, and they took religious, what came later to be understood religious sciences, very, very seriously, and did not see that as separate from other other forms of pursuits of knowledge. So, just the way people thought of knowledge and pursuit of knowledge, and the characters who pursued knowledge was much more holistic, and this distinction did not exist. The distinction obviously comes from modernity because it is very much when education fragments with the rise of modernity. Some of it through colonialism, some of it is just colonial, like in India and other places, colonial authorities setting up education systems to train people for the sake of serving the empire, the bureaucracy that was developing, but also for the sake of modernizing the colonized. For example, there is a lot of literature on this that the British India took education very seriously. The British authorities in India took education very seriously, and they taught that education was a way not only for them to produce the people with technical knowledge they needed to actually demand the operation of the empire, create the locals who could rely on to actually run their colonial government. But also they thought it was a way for them to change the minds. And there is a famous saying that through education reform in India, they were trying to create. There is, I think, it's one of the higher colonial authority was saying we're trying to create Indian people with British tastes. So the idea that we're just trying to imprint some of our ideas on the local population through education. So it was this rise of modern education, or that in some colonial and in some other contexts it was not necessarily directly colonial. It was the new nation states. I think the word nation state may be premature, but the new states that were forming, modern states that were forming in the region, trying to catch up with European or trying to implement the European model, be it in Ottoman, be it in Iran Shah during the Shah, or be it in Afghanistan during the 20th century with Amanullah Khan reforms, or even prior to that, Abdurrahman Khan. They brought some form of education in, modern quote unquote education, as a way to imitate what they thought was the recipe for success in Europe. Early on, it was very limited. Some of it was related to what government cared about, engineering, military sciences, but later it became more of like a public education. The idea was that we need to train more and more. Obviously, even then it was limited to the elites, but that is when the governments start having an interest in creating a general, quote unquote, secular modern education system, and the madrasa became the other of that. And it was generally been a tense history. There was a lot of resistance to this modern education. It was seen as foreign imposed. It seemed as corrupting because always, as you pointed out, education was seen as a way that you would shape people's minds, shape basically their character. At least the elites, because public education, in terms of like everybody having access to education, is a modern thing. But at least the elites would shape through education, and the idea that something other than religiously infused education would shape the character of elite was something that was considered to be a corrupting effect of modernity and European influence. But the governments had very keen interest in developing this and put a lot of resources into this. Early on, a lot of it actually was like to make it more concrete, in the country of Afghanistan, when the states were trying to do this, sometimes they were trying to do it by reforming madrasas, adding things to the existing madrasas, not setting up completely something completely separate. Sometimes it was parallel institutions, sometimes it was reformers of madrasas. Sadly, those earlier efforts to reform madrasas, like synthesize modern and religious education in one set of institutions, failed. And it failed mostly because, and it's a long story of why it failed. But one of the main reasons it failed was that madrasa was not willing. The madrasa, the madrasa was not the people who were running madrasas and religious education. But they saw themselves in a defensive pose, and they were not willing to acquiesce to these reform projects because they saw that as diluting the character of traditional practices of religious learning. So in a sense, they accepted their limited role and focused on religious education and conceded the other areas of education that were historically associated with madrasas, as you pointed out, like all forms of knowledge were studied in these places that are now considered to be exclusively religious subject. They conceded that to the general education. They conceded that to modern education. They conceded that to the government-run schools, and basically retreated to exclusively religious education as a way to protect what they thought was the core or the core of religious education, as a way to preserve the tradition. They saw reform as basically a veiled attempt at attacking, undermining the tradition, and religious education was the kind of the guardian of that. The religious traditions, and the madrasa was considered to be a guardian of that, and they were not willing to allow for those reforms to take place, which kind of cemented this distinction of modern versus madrasa, general versus madrasa, secular versus madrasa education. The madrasa education became exclusively associated with religious education. Professor Ibrahim Musa, What is Madrasa, has written a great deal on this in the context of subcontinent, how it came to be, how this kind of much more inclusive, multifaceted, interdisciplinary kind of practice of learning, institutionalized in madrasa. And while it was being institutionalized in madrasas, like for example, the Deobandi madrasa was one of the earlier kind of institutionalized format. It took the form of modern education in the colonial context, meaning it was administratively looked like a school that would that maybe the British would recognize. The idea of regular exams, the idea of issuing like certificates, the idea of the bureaucracy, those things were burned. So it became administratively, organizationally modern, but at the same time became exclusively religious because it was not, and kind of gave up or conceded the other forms of knowledge to quote unquote secular knowledge or secular schools or colonial schools as a way to protect what it considered to be the core of religious tradition. They did the changing with time, especially under the threat of colonialism and position of colonial authority. Changing with time was considered to be a threat to the tradition. And in India, that is not only so. The Deoband is one part of the story, but as you may know, there were other universities, places of education that were established that were religious in character that kind of embrace some of the modern education a little more, and often they're contradistinct. But that the genealogy of madrasa comes from that encounter with modernity and that retreat to religious sciences and conceding the other forms of knowledge to the secular, and in the process becoming in itself a little more modern in terms of form, keeping the content, organizationally. At least in the case of Deoband, Afghanistan has a bit of a different history, but some of that also happened, right? Abdurrahman Khan, for example, is the first. It starts like the first public madrasa in Afghanistan, government funded, and government trying to exert some control, often in the name of increasing quality and providing patronage. Increasing the ranking of those places where it became public madrasas, giving them standing, giving them their graduates some standing in the government, like recognition, and as creating kind of flagship madrasas that would be modern in form, because of the way they were trying to organizationally set themselves up. Um, and you can see traces of that until today. Like, if you, to bring it to today, there was when Taliban took over, there was a similar debate. As you may know, there was the idea that there's a separation between madrasa and schools in Afghanistan, like maktab and madrasa, and that should be the gap should be closed. There's no need to have two separate kind of tracks for education. It should be unified, should be synthesized. We should have a unified education system where people learn both religious sciences and general science, general subjects, religious subjects, and general subjects. But and there were many advocates for this within the Taliban, saying we need to do this. We need to. There's no need to have this. It's a product of coloniality. It's a product of governments who are trying to Europeanize and modernize the country, that they created these two tracks that are not wrong. Historically, that is how it came to be. They wanted to synthesize it. They wanted to reverse that historical development. But it failed when Taliban produced their own approved curriculum. They reproduced what was traditionally the religious subjects exclusively and did not include more general subjects in the curriculum of the curriculum madrasas. And it had to do with tradition, because to do so would have required overhauling the entire model of madrasa, the traditional way the madrasas were run. So, in the name of preserving the tradition, for the sake of preserving the tradition, they gave up on this kind of more ambitious reform project that might have synthesized or created a kind of a uniform, holistic education system in Afghanistan. And it's kind of reminiscent of that, those earlier moments where, for the sake of preserving tradition, they conceded ground to modernity. And it seems like Taliban were also now willing to reclaim that ground and create a uniform education system, because not because they maybe were worried about what may happen to modern education, but they were worried about what would happen to traditional religious kind of education. And they were not willing to, because it has to do with legitimacy. You cannot. They considered that to be those reforms to be considered illegitimate because it would break from the established traditions of how madrasas were operating, how religious sciences were being transmitted through time. They saw that maybe as a too far of a bridge to cross, and they thought those reforms would be considered illegitimate. And what would be created would not be the madrasas that was understood to be the way that religious knowledge should be transmitted. If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. As you were speaking, I thought it was interesting that in the first period between 1992 and 2001, when the Taliban came to power, what they did with regards to this, attempting to merge the two system, or I do not know much, but I do remember very vaguely my friends who went to school, who were in high school at that time. They talk about all the religious subjects being added to the general education. So it was almost the curriculum reform within the general education that shifted drastically, and all these books, religious books, were added, and some general education books, generally the sciences that they were removed from the curriculum. I wonder if they did had a similar debate in the first time round, because the second time, this is a very interesting point that you made. They had to concede ground in order to preserve the 200 years of development of madrasa. Essentially, to merge the two together, they would have had to question and overhaul the entire system, and that would have created a lot of backlash. So presumably from a government, or picking who you want to fight with, that's a smart thing to do for them, not to engage in that kind of reform. That's one question. Did they have the same question during their first period or not? And the other thing is, even before the Taliban, so under the Republic, there were a lot of madrasas that were operating in Afghanistan. I wonder how much tension has existed since in the last 50 years or so, because we do know that in the course of 20th century, general education, the normal schools that we know about, that became the mainstream, that took over. So essentially, how much tension has there been between the two?
Um, So great question. So the first time Taliban ruled the country, they did not get to do a lot of state building. As you may know, the as you very well know, the fighting did not stop. This whole idea of state building was kind of not in fashion the way the post 2001 kind of order was focused on state building. State building became in fashion, and there was a lot of attention, resources dedicated to this. So I think they did not have the opportunity to do it just because the fighting did not stop. They did not have the resources that would help them maybe accomplish something like this. Afghanistan then was much poorer than it is now. It's hard to imagine. The country is still very poor, but it was much poorer then. The government was much, much smaller. And they inherited a government that was completely dysfunctional because the years of infighting had destroyed whatever minimal institutions were built through the short period of state building in Afghanistan throughout the 20th century. So there was very minimal state and that was in disarray. There was not enough resources, and I think the mindset of the state building was not in vogue as much as it might have been. So that is why this time around there's a lot more attention paid to the state building by the Taliban. Their energy is not spent on fighting as much because there's no serious internal military threat. They inherited a government that was much more expansive. The idea of service delivery, the idea of um, a government that had certain obligations, certain responsibilities, the idea that the government had to administer so many different things in a formalized way. Because governance has always been there, as you know better than I do, but the government, in terms of the government bureaucracy and institutions actually administrating the lives of people, it had expanded. And since 2001 because of the massive investment in building the institutions. So the Taliban took over that. So there was the idea of, okay, so there's this government, it exists, it has this apparatus, how we can make it ours in a sense. Early on, they did very little. As you may know, the kind of the skeleton of government they inherited did not change much. The ministries more or less operated. Even they expanded bureaucracy a little bit. They had to, I think, downsize later on just due to budgetary issues. But early on, even they might have expanded bureaucracy. Maybe they appointed more people to government roles, to official government roles, than maybe they were employed even before. And then all areas of like education, health, policing, all those became a question of, okay, so we have this system, this government machinery. How can we implement our ideology through it? People think about this Ministry of Vice and Virtue, which is uniquely Taliban in terms of their vision. It's very unique to them, and they put a lot of resources in it. But there were other areas of government they had to think about what are we going to do with education. Obviously, they took the Minister of Education, but the madrasas became the project, especially the Jihadi madrasas became the Emir's project as a way that they would, in their mind, Islamize the education. But basically, they became a vehicle for them to implement their ideological vision of how we're going to create the new generation of Talibs. Because remember, Taliban, as you may know, is a movement that is in government. So they see themselves not just the government, but just a broader social movement. And the idea of how you reproduce it over time, how you make sure this movement continues is a serious question for them. And education has always been the core of it. The madrasas have always been a basis for the Taliban to recruit people who are ideologically aligned and also willing to sacrifice for the movement. Now they're a different world in a sense that material sacrifice, just going for a fight to prove your loyalty or dedicate yourself to the cause of the Taliban is not as much of a need anymore. People they don't need people to go fight, and therefore this litmus test of who was dedicated to the cause, who was willing to fight for the cause, is gone. So now you have to find a different way to first of all train people in the kind of thinking you would like, but also prove their loyalty, show their commitment to the cause to ways other than fighting. So education, like learning, commitment to learning, was seen as an alternative. That's why for the Emir, the Jihadi methods are very important. It's a way that movement is going to reproduce itself over time, because the Emir is very concerned, and some of the Taliban top leadership is very concerned that now that they're government, people would join their ranks just for money, for positions, and they lose that movement, kind of a spirit of the movement that is a very common thing. Like revolutionaries uh, people who are part of the resistance, once they win, once they become the power, then they have to deal with this kind of lack of this kind of this loss of that the spirit that animated the movement. Now that they're in power, um, they have different responsibilities, but also the incentives changes. So they are very much worried about how the movement will be reproduced over time. Now that they don't have the basically the crucible of jihad to turn people into committed, diehard, ideologically committed members of the movement who they can rely, can trust, because they have proven their commitment to the cause through making sacrifices, putting themselves in harm's way. How you kind of continue to have those kind of core ideologically committed people in absence of a jihad? And the answer has been madrasa. And that's why they're very, very keen on the, expanding madrasas as a way to actually reproduce the movement over time. It's very much part of their governance system, not necessarily institutionally in terms of because for the Taliban, it's a pre-modern kind of way of thinking about governance. Government is not necessarily about the bureaucracy or like the setup of how the institutions are operating. It's more about who staff those institutions. For example, constitution is not as important for them, but having people who believe they have the right kind of knowledge, right kind of attitudes in charge of government is very much more important. So it's not about sitting down and writing kind of the rules that would create incentives for bad people to do the right thing. It's about having the right people in positions of power, trusting them that they will be guided by this sense of morality and sense of knowledge of how the government should be operating based on their knowledge of religious laws, and letting them kind of run the ship. They do some codifications, but if you read their code, it's really not any kind of a serious attempt at actually having a blueprint for governance. For example, recently there was this regulations on divorce and separation, judicial separation between spouses. There's language about slavery there. There's language about classes there, and I don't think even Taliban are committed to recreating. They keep the language because they want to preserve the integrity of uh, uh, Islamic law from pre-modern sources. So they don't. It's the same. They don't give them some permission to update or reform the religious knowledge as it was transmitted in pre-modern sources that they consider to be authentic sources, even when those sources have kind of come completely have become irrelevant to the actual lived experiences of Muslims, because they feel that would create a crisis of legitimacy. So in a sense, these rules are not as much meant to be there are statements about what is right and wrong, the statements about the integrity and standing of classical sources, and not as much prescriptions about how the government should be operated. Probably the judiciary is going to operate the way it was operating before these rules were enacted. They're enacting them as a way to act like a state, but I don't think they are really meant to be the blueprint for how the judiciary is operating. Because the idea is that the judiciary should be staffed by people who went to madrasas, studied fiqh and religious sciences in the right way. They have the right attitude to put them in charge. We'll trust them to make the right decisions, and they're not going to be guided by some text that we produced. They're going to be guided by the education they received through years of the madrasas. It's a very different kind of attitude towards governance than we see in modern kind of a nation states. And Taliban are grappling with that. There's a paradox. Obviously, they want to act like a nation state, but at the same time, their imagination of governance and how it would work hasn't really this idea of rule-based, impersonal, kind of code-based kind of operation of the state hasn't really seeped in to that their imagination of governance. The pre-modern way of having quote unquote the right people with the right education, meaning with the right kind of attitudes, with the right kind of references about right and wrong, who have proven loyalty to the movement, like their intentions, their motives are not in question. Seem that is what produces the results they are after. It does not lend itself with kind of a more scientific forms of governance or the more legalistic understanding of governance that lawyers who are trained in more of a modern kind of law schools would even recognize. That's why these new legislative codes that Taliban enact sometimes just trips people up. They kind of think like Taliban are going to bring back slavery. Taliban are going to bring back this and that. But that's not it, because in their mind of a modern reader of a code, they read this as like, this is what the state is going to use to remake the society. This is how the judiciary from now on will operate. But that is really not it. The lawmaking for them is a very different exercise. Um, and it speaks to this fact of the kind of their attitudes towards governance. When they make rules about public companies, when they make rules about retaking public lands, those are much more procedural, and they're much more meant to create organizations and processes. Those are more closely kind of resemble what we consider the laws in the modern context. But when they are attempting to legislate something that is the core of fiqh, religious sciences like family law, criminal procedures, when a text is produced, the text is superfluous. It's like they're restating what the classical sources were saying, what they believe the classical sources were saying, not as a way that this would become a blueprint for like a rule-based kind of. And there are a lot of gaps in those rules. They're partial codification. They're not meant to dislodge the established practices. They're just meant to be add the tappings of a modern state that has codes and laws, often for a foreign audience, or often for a general audience. And the assumption is the actual work of governance will be done by people who have the right education, and we didn't need any of this anyways, because it is what they were trained in, if that makes sense, and they have the right attitude.
Yeah, I think what you're pointing out is something really fundamental, and if you don't understand this about the way the Taliban function or think, it is very difficult to understand these laws and all these different announcements that come one after the other in the media. I think this is a crucial thing to understand, that this is a individual-based rather than a constitutional way of thinking that we are so used to. So essentially, that's what makes it so brittle as well. And I mean, if we link this to a much longer history, Islamic history of ruling, most rulers or Muslim rulers have failed to recognize that this is what, if you like, this is what guarantees continuity. And being an individual and ruling, and then once you die, there is a fight that breaks out. And I think Ottoman Empire, for example, is a perfect example of this. Every time a sultan dies, then the next sultan has to kill a whole bunch of people in order to actually win the throne. And then the same thing happens when that sultan goes away. Anyway, I thought this is a perfect timing to transition into more specific findings of the paper that you've written. I was going to say recently, but it's not so recent, about a year ago or a year and a half ago. But still, these things don't change much. So the findings there and the insights are very, very interesting. I think one of the central findings in that paper was that religious education is becoming increasingly organized and regulated. What I'm interested in is to know, what do you mean by that? So what has changed since 2001? I mean, I'm not focusing so much my questions and discussion on the issue of banning schools for girls and banning higher education for women. I mean, these are policies that we know extensively about them, and a lot has been written. So I'm focusing more on these little insights that are often ignored and not picked up. While the general education, the mainstream education that we were talking about is banned, you have this other thing that is happening inside of Afghanistan, and it merits an understanding, and we should know what's going on. So when you said this is becoming increasingly organized and regulated, and I think you pointed out to it earlier on as well, that this is a form of, continuity, and this is where it's heading. If you want to speak to that a little bit more, then
Sure. Yeah. So
I have two more questions.
absolutely. So what we were looking at was a set of measures that Taliban implemented with regard to madrasas in Afghanistan since they returned to power in 2021, and we're trying to make sense of it. Why are they doing it? And the general thesis we come up with is that they are trying to um, exert more control over the religious education through different ways. Some of it was by standardizing things, prescribing uniform curriculum, and some of it had to do with creating model madrasas, the madrasas they believed was delivering the right kind of education. The Jihadi madrasas are an example of this. And why they were doing it, they were concerned, as I said, but primarily about the survival of the movement. We need to have the right, we need to continue to graduate or train the right people who would go on to keep the movement alive, movement beyond the state, but then the movement that the state is reliant upon so it's kind of a broader base for the actual state that they're in charge of now. And the in terms of we try to kind of explain the actual policies from Minister of Higher Education, from Minister of Education, the Directorate of the Jihadi madrasas and orphanages. The director is based in Kandahar, that is tasked with overseeing this. We try to look at the content of the policy, the issues, the curriculum they have issued, what are they about, and this is also this other phenomenon, female madrasas that are allowed to exist, even though they're not as formalized, they're not given as much attention, even by the Taliban, but they exist. They're implicitly sanctioned, and they have become a growing. They become increasingly a place where women are taught by women. Religious science subjects in some of them, but some other places it goes even beyond strictly religious sciences. That creates actually some anxiety for the Taliban as well, because they don't want this to become a loophole, quote unquote loophole, for general education to take place, and that's why there were even rumors that the Taliban may actually close down female madrasas as well. But despite these anxieties, they continue to exist for female madrasas, and women continue to seek education there, primarily religious education, but with some other forms of knowledge mixed in there. And we're also interested to see what is the impact of that. What are these madrasas going to do? What are the graduates going to do? First of all, why they came to be, how they came to be, and also what does that mean for the future of religious discourse and political discourse in Afghanistan? Because we may witness a larger cohort of women who are trained in the religious sciences being produced through these female madrasas, and would that give these people a standing to engage in religious kind of political discourse? Would they become voices in the public kind of discourse of governance in Afghanistan, given that knowledge of religious law, knowledge of Islamic law seems to be giving permission to people to speak on matters of governance under the Taliban? It's the ulama that are supposed to advise the state. It's the ulama that are supposed to be basically have a say on how governance should be done. What if that alim, quote unquote, happens to be a woman? What are they going to be speaking about? What are they going to be saying, and how their role going to emerge from this dynamic? It's very early to say, because female madrasas are kind of new. They existed in Afghanistan, but in very limited fashion. They've grown, and we were speculating on that front. Like, okay, what would mean for more women to learn religious subjects, become alama, and become learned in matters of religion, and then go on to exercise that voice and speak on matters of public concerns like women's education, women's health, and governance as it relates to women's issues. How it would change the experience of women under the Taliban, how it may change the Taliban's policies towards women, which are now exclusively prescribed by the male ulama, right? And there are some indications that may suggest that it may have a positive impact, positive in relative terms on the experiences of women, because the limited data we have from the people who are teaching at these madrasas, they tend to have opinions that diverge from established policies. They believe that women should have a right to education that goes beyond religious sciences. And they believe that women should have a right to receive to a livelihood and job, subject to restrictions of parda, subject to hijab, subject to segregation. But they tend to be, even though they're very much remain committed to domesticity of women and the male authority over women that are established in classical sources, they're committed to those, but they still are advocating for recognition of the rights of women that go beyond what the established policies are. So we're interested in that dynamic of how it could play out if that cohort of female ulama becomes larger and becomes more vocal, and how Taliban would kind of negotiate the relationship with them, because that's another interesting part. It is not clear whether Taliban have made up their mind whether they would want female talibs, like female members of the movement. They generally seem to not allow any public role for women. As a higher level, the core conservative leaders of the movement may not want to have it, like the Iran has. There are other religious movements, restorative religious movement, traditional religious movement. Even in Pakistan, female medicines are very much present. They want in their competition or their fight with the secular education system, with the media, with what they consider to be foreign influences. They want to recruit women in that cultural war, and they want women who went to madrasas to become basically their fighters in that fight and represent a different kind of womanhood or feminine womanness, a Muslim womanness, as a way to counter what they perceive as the West is offering. Taliban don't seem to have that kind of vision. They seem to believe, the top core leadership, conservative leadership, believes that limiting women's in the domestic space, in the home, is enough. They don't seem to be that eager to recruit Afghan women in their fight against what they may perceive as the westernized idea of womanhood. However, as I said, the top leadership may not have want that, but there is still there's a lot of that going on different levels. If you go just join Facebook, there are a lot of female madrasas that have accounts. There are female madrasa teachers that have accounts that promote, I said, their understanding of hijab. They express their commitment to the what they consider to be the Islamic version of womanhood, and they voice a lot of support for Taliban policies that are restrictive towards women's rights to education and work and such. But by doing so, they're acting as public agents. Right? They're engaging in politics. So even though it is in the service of maybe a political project that considers women a low role in a very circumscribed way, but these female agents, these people are becoming female agents through education, through madrasas, through female madrasas, kind of acquiring the authority to speak on these matters, are engaging in a radical act of kind of a political act, if you look at it from the Taliban's governance kind of discourse. So that was what thing we're interested in. But in terms of the madrasa in general, if you put the issue of female madrasas aside, Taliban have tried to basically exert as much control as they could over the madrasa landscape. And it's not clear how much success they have, because the madrasas have always kind of valued their autonomy in Afghanistan. We never really had government-run madrasa systems in Afghanistan. There are Darul Uloom and Darul Hifaz that are government-owned and run, but they are like a fraction of a percentage of the overall population of madrasas in Afghanistan. They tend to be community-dependent. They tend to be autonomous, and they value that autonomy. And they have a positive relationship with the Taliban. They see Taliban not in the general sentiment that the Taliban and their commitment to religious governance is something they support, but they have still disagreements. The people we interviewed from madrasas were not very open in their criticism, but they voiced hopes that the Taliban would change their policies on many fronts, including on women's issues, but also on other fronts. So the idea is there's disagreements between the madrasa folks, the teachers, the students, and the administrators of madrasas, and the Taliban. And the Taliban desire to increasingly control madrasas and increasingly bring madrasas under their control as a way to make sure those madrasas actually become a base of support for the Taliban. is not going to be is not going to be a seamless project. It's just institutionally as well, madrasas are just this is like a very expansive and deep kind of institutions that have deep history, deeply embedded in communities. And it's not as easy to dislodge them from communities and completely integrate them in a governance system. But Taliban are trying. Registration is on the rise. The Jali medicines as well, and they are seen as like the head of the error. This is how they are much more closely aligned with the state, and they are given some authority over the other madrasas in the area as well. So they become like the model madrasas or the government sanctioned madrasas that are meant to exercise some influence over the other madrasas in the vicinity. That is the design, or that's the hope, or that's the idea. But many madrasas is still most madrasas preserve their autonomy. Most established madrasas preserve their autonomy, and they teach what they would like to teach based on the preference of their teachers, their founders, and the purpose of the community they're part of. And we are nowhere near having like serious control from the state over these madrasas in terms of how their actual operations is. Registration is a different issue. They have been able to maybe get more madrasas registered, but the actual dictating how what the madrasas are teaching, how they're operating, who teaches, is much more difficult to do.
Can I ask? I think we've been talking a lot about madrasas and these other models of madrasas, the community embedded, and the state owned and run or influenced. How much do we know about the model of these community madrasas? It seems like a black box. Can we unravel that a little bit? To a Western audience, when you say madrasa, it's almost like a black box. What is this? If we take a step back and unbox it a little bit, I think that will be very helpful.
You're absolutely right. So the term madrasa it's a very broad term. It covers like a room in somebody's house where some young kids may go and learn how to read Quran, to like an institution that may expand many buildings, has a real campus and teaches thousands of people from up from reading how to read the Quran up to advanced science of jurisprudence and theology and Islamic exegesis of scriptures, tafsir. Like, so it is expansive. There are some, and the term madrasas, like this undistinguished way that we often use, it's a kind of a product of the Western discourse about religious education within the Muslim communities. There's much more variation, right? Sometimes the English scholarship tries to distinguish between like Quranic schools, where there's like very much focus on just teaching people how to read the Quran, and madrasas where there's not higher sciences that are being taught. We also have Darul Hafaz in Afghanistan, which is focused on just memorizing the Quran or the correct recitation of the Quran, and they not to engage as much and with higher kind of sciences like jurisprudence and theology or Islamic exegesis. But in terms of the community-based nature of it, madrasas generally, so the transmission of religious sciences in Islamic thought is generally the responsibility of the community. It's not a state responsibility. It's not the job of the state to make sure that religious sciences continue. It is the job of the Muslim community. And that's why when you have a community established, just like a village that kind of becomes like just a bunch of homes that show up somewhere, the first thing they do is they establish a masjid, a mosque. That's sort of the first defining feature, right? In Afghanistan, the way that geography works, so you have the way the neighborhoods emerge is often they're organized around the masjid. It's the people who go to the masjid that kind of constitute that neighborhood. And it is very organic the way it comes to be. When the numbers of homes increase, they try to distinguish themselves from the neighboring neighborhood by establishing their own mosque. So it becomes the center of the community. So this becomes a unit that is recognizable as being one unit in comparison to maybe the neighboring village or the kind of the clusters of the homes that exist somewhere else. And it's actually much more real than that, because in the efforts to support and man that mosque, like recruit a preacher or a alim that would take care of the mosque, they would have to pull resources. So there's actual like cooperation of like, this is kind of a ground up emerged kind of form of collective action that is happening, people getting together, raising the money to build it, and then sustain it, pay the salary. And one of the first things that follows from having that one person work for the community, the alim, the mullah, whatever a person's name is, that is appointed to that first communal institution of masjid, is teaching the young kids how to read the Quran. So you can see like the birth of that kind of a prototype of madrasa, the Quranic school, is very much concomitant, like it happened at the same time when the community is born. But because that's just the first act of establishing community is establishing the mosque, and almost immediately after that, that mosque becomes a place where the kids will learn at least very how to read the Quran. Often it goes beyond that. In the context where modern education was not very much accessible, modern meaning general education was not very accessible, these Quranic schools basically were a place where people learned how to read and write. And to a very good degree, because it was not just the recitation of Quran, which requires some level of literacy to be able to read the Quran, but also went on, as you know, the books of poetry, Persian literature was a big part of it. I myself read Persian literature in these places because it was not seen as something separate from religious education. The moral lessons that are embedded in those works of Persian poetry, their work of literature, there were, I think the author did not think of them as something separate than religious sciences, but they were taught by these community also be part of uh, bringing kids up with the right character, religious character, and that involved reading the Quran, but also involved learning something about Persian poetry. In some places, maybe the community is bigger, there's much more desire, and these places grow into Darul Hafaz often early on, where places where kids learn to recite the Quran more properly and then memorize it. But if the community grows, and it could turn into a much more sophisticated madrasas where the mosque is bigger and there is an accompanying boarding kind of place where people come and learn jurisprudence, and that's kind of how it grows. You need resources, so just the size of the community matters. Like a small village would have a hard time supporting a madrasa, so you need resources. Some of it is just has to do with the size of the community. Some of it has to do with just the demographic of the people in that community. Often, if somebody becomes successful from that place, like becomes a successful merchant, becomes a successful government official, that becomes a minister, general, whatever, as a one way they give back to their community, or one way they cement their standing in the community, is to provide support for the mosque and allow it to grow. And one sign that mosque grows is buildings and expanding. But another sign it grows is this: the educational aspect of it also grows. So the madrasa is established along with the masjid. And it is often established by the donations from these notable members of that community. So if a community becomes very much, the members of the community go on to become successful in the private sector, in the government sector, that's a good indicator of that community being able to grow its masjid into a more complex kind of establishment that has a madrasa component. And then the select few, as you know, it's kind of a pyramid shape, like the Quranic, the masjid and Quranic lessons are everywhere, but then you have like a small fraction of that where you would have more resources dedicated to provide more education and boarding, and then become something that we would recognize more of as a madrasa. And then there are select few that are not rural anymore; they become urban because of the resources they need, the size they have, and they become like flagship. But this is like Jalalabad has flagships one, Herat has flagship ones. They're not serving a community like a village, they're serving a city or serving a province, and they become much more flagship, much more established. Taliban have recognized Jamia, the term, Arabic term used for university, two or three of them, Minister of Higher Education, because education up to 14th grade in Afghanistan is under authority of Minister of Education, but beyond 14th grade is under authority of Minister of Higher Education. And in the past, there was really no madrasa. There were Sharia faculties part of the university system, but there was no madrasa that had any relationship with the Minister of Higher Education, because madrasas delivered up to 14th grade of education. Now Taliban are allowing these madrasas, these flagship urban-based Kandahar, Nangarhar-based, Jalalabad-based madrasas, and Herat has one as well. These urban-based, very, very expansive, very, very resource-rich, relatively speaking, places to issue degrees or credentials up to bachelor's, master's, and it's imaginable there'll be PhD as well. It hasn't happened yet, but it could.
Interesting. As you were speaking, I studied in a masjid like this as well. You learn how to read the Arabic language without learning to be able to speak it. So you end up being able to read the Quran, but not able to speak Arabic or understand beyond the Quranic Arabic. And then straight after that, you study a bunch of Persian literature books where you learn how to read and write. Um, Much later, I realized this is what you would call, at the risk of categorizing and labeling, but to help us understand it. I think or to help map this landscape a little bit better, what you were saying. I thought, or the way I understood it, is this: that there is a legacy of what you may call the Bukhara school of thought or education, religious thought in Afghanistan, where it is much more rudimentary and unstructured and not very organizationally modern. And at the same time, there are these replications of Deoband from India, which is much more organizationally hierarchical and modern and structured. And these are the ones that are more urban and bigger, and they have much more recognized levels and certification and so on. Whereas most of these community madrasas, even though I think they have become somewhat influenced by the labeling or by the nomenclature of the Deobandi schools, but they still remain very unstructured. So the way you study theology, like Kalam, or the way you study fiqh, they just go in tandem, and sometimes this not very coherent. And this exists within all these communities. And this is decentral, community embedded, and out of the reach of the state. And naturally, there is a tension between them and the state, who tries to control and tries to regulate. And the state would have incentives to bring them into the fold, or create these mechanisms to actually regulate them and buy more legitimacy and political support. Anyway, we have a couple of minutes left. There were two questions as well. I would hand over to you if I haven't asked anything that you want to say. Please do. We can go over a
Sure. I
couple
mean,
of minutes.
yeah. I think there are a couple of questions from Farhad in the chat. I'll be happy to go over them, so we have given a chance for the participants.
So I think the main question is that do you reckon that the current madrasas are the same as the madrasas before Amir Abdurrahman Khan, or the ones after them? What has changed? I think it's a much broader topic, but if you want to pick one
Right.
small
So
end
I
of
think
it.
what is interesting about Amir Abdurrahman Khan is this idea that at the birth of modern nation state, at least when the Afghan rulers started to think about state building in a serious way, one thing they thought about was the relationship to the education system. And at the time, the education system was just madrasas. And Abdul Khan established the public madrasa, like a flagship, public, quote unquote, like a state sanctioned madrasas. And the graduate madrasa became very important later on. They became influential in even Amanullah Khan's kind of the state building project, because the idea was that we need the rulers of Afghanistan early on realized we need some symbiotic relationship between the ulama class and the political class. It was a very tenuous kind of relationship. They sometimes were supportive, and they could become they had some sort of autonomy. They aligned and disaligned themselves with the authorities, and they made and unmade rulers in Afghanistan, as you may know. They control this idea of jihad. That was supposed to be the way the rulers are held accountable. If a ruler deviates from the right path too much, they could organize people, mobilize people against them. So the idea was that how can you manage this relationship better institutionally? And one idea was, okay, we're going to create madrasas where we'll bring the teachers, like this the notable ulamas, and elevate them, but also we'll produce graduates who have much more close connections with the state, because it will be a institution that is sanctioned, patterned, receives patronage from the state. And also, not just institutionally, but also in terms of the actual knowledge being produced, they want that knowledge to be a little more modernized. So it's still, it's in the context of Afghanistan, a very traditional form of religious education, but at least there is much more, and the people, these public madrasas were much more welcoming or supportive of modernizing efforts by the Afghan rulers. For example, the Amanullah Khan's reforms, that were much more progressive than Amir Abdurrahman Khan, were sanctioned by elite members of the ulama who came from those public madrasas that Amir Abdurrahman Khan established. So this was kind of the idea that we need to select a handful of ulama who are maybe more sympathetic towards our state building project, and home them or house them in these flagship madrasas as a way to elevate their status and as a way to cement the relation with the state, because that's central to generating legitimacy for our state building reforms. It was very early on they realized that. It was at a time where it was obviously not unique to Afghanistan. This kind of dynamic was playing out across the kind of Muslim world. This encounter with modernity and the changes it generated in terms of attitude towards governance, attitude towards education, and how the relationship between the state and the ulama class had to be managed at the moment where states were trying to the kind of the horizon of state building and societal reform kind of changed from changed to, and they started looking towards the West and Europe as the model. So there was some tension between modernity and tradition became much more acute. The kind of the rulers realized that they have to manage the state ulama relationship there, and the madrasas, public madrasas, or madrasas where states had a lot more hands in them, was important. So you can see that from early on until now, where the Taliban kind of see that relationship to madrasas and building and rebuilding of madrasas, building both in terms of physical madrasas, but also just in terms of what kind of character these madrasas will have, who will be teaching them, what they will be teaching there, and the kind of attitude they will engender in the people who go there, as being key to their state building projects, as it being key in generating support and legitimacy for the kind of governments they want to do. And the independent autonomous madrasas, where independently minded ulama will exist, was always seen as something that needs to be managed by the state, needed to be managed. And the states have drawn a lot more legitimacy from the Islamic sources like the Taliban. Feel this much more maybe acutely than the Republic, which more or less was willing to just abandon madrasas, meaning it allowed them to exist, supported them even financially, but did not see itself, did not see madrasa reforms or expansion of madrasa as a big part of its state building project. It was actually good for madrasas. They kind of grew a lot during the Republic. It had to do with the economics and other social factors as well, but madrasas grew a lot under the Republic, and they were left alone, more or less. And under Taliban, they have to grapple with both kind of the twin dynamic of receiving more resources, maybe more recognition, more standing, but at the same time, a lot more hands-on government involvement. And they have to navigate both. And some madrasas different madrasas have done this differently. I know we are over time, so I don't want to go beyond. And the point about the إدارة التعليمات التكنيكية ومسلكية is well taken. It was part of the Ministry of Education. They became an independent directorate. Taliban have taken back some of those independent directorate back. But I think TVET still remains an independent directorate. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. I can't help think of power-knowledge relations theory as you were speaking throughout, this dichotomy and tension between madrasas and the state, from Abdurrahman Khan all the way to the Taliban and the struggle that continues. They power and knowledge are not separate, essentially. They create each other, and knowledge is not neutral, and the pursuit of the state is to create that non-neutral knowledge, essentially. Okay, thank you very much, and thank you everyone who's been listening. I really enjoyed this conversation, and thank you for waking up so early in the morning and talking to us. Our team will put up the recording on YouTube and the rest of the social media, so people can watch it later.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Ling,
Okay.
and thank you for those who took the
Thank you.
time to be here. Assalamu alaikum.
So.